Continuing on in the study of First Kings, coming into First Kings chapter 18, very unique, very cool story. If you can say that about a Bible story. I was telling my wife what I was going to be teaching for Mike today, and told her what the story was, and she said, that sounds like a really fun story to teach out of the Bible whenever it involves fire and swords. So I was like, you know what, that sounds awesome. But with that, we are in 1 Kings chapter 18, and this is a story where Elijah, the prophet, Elijah, Elijah, the first one, Elijah, confronts the prophets of Baal. And God does something miraculous to, prove he's the one true living God, to prove his power, to prove his truth. But ultimately, we'll see what the purpose of this moment in the history of Israel was. But so where we're at in Israel's history is also important to understand before we get into this. We're in the post-Davidic covenant, or post-Davidic kingship. That means that in 2 Samuel 7, when David was king of Israel, God made a covenant with him stating that there would always be a descendant of his sitting on his throne. And so we're post that promise. So God made that promise. Some time has gone on. And then we're also post David's son Solomon's reign. And Solomon, yes, he was the wisest man who ever lived. God granted him with some divine wisdom. He was also incredibly wealthy, but at the same time, a lot of this wealth and a lot of this prestige that came with Solomon, he made some very poor decisions. And God made it very clear in Deuteronomy 17 how the kings of Israel were to live, to lead, to shepherd, to servant lead the people of Israel. And it seemed like Solomon, as he got more famous, more wealthy, he began to do a lot of the exact opposite things with regards to marrying a lot of women, marrying non-Israelite women, the women who worship false gods. And by marrying so many women, which in and of itself is not God's design for marriage of one man, one woman for a lifetime, he's obviously breaking against that with polygamy and things along those lines, but also marrying these women who brought in these false gods. It turned his heart away from being obedient to God as well. And so, in Solomon's reign, these women led his heart away from God, led him towards idol worship, and with that, he began to build these temples to these false gods throughout the kingdom of Israel. And as the leader goes, so go the people. And so that time frame, immorality, covenant breaking between Israel and God began to happen. Ultimately, the nation of Israel and the people of Israel began to commit spiritual adultery on God. And they started to also worship these false gods. So, with that, God in 1 Kings 12 divides the kingdom of Israel due to Solomon's just poor decision making, poor being a father, not teaching his sons who were to be of the line of David to be king over Israel due to the Davidic covenant, not teaching them the things that God desires for them, not leading as God desires for them to be. God divides the kingdom. And there's the southern kingdom, which is the tribe of Judah and the Levitical priesthood, and then the northern kingdom is everybody else. And so that's what is happening right now in 1 Kings 18, is that there's now two kingdoms. The northern kingdom, which is everybody but Judah and the Levitical priesthood. And ultimately, idolatry to false gods becomes the norm. And worship of Yahweh begins to become more and more ignored. And if you read through the whole book of 1 Kings, you see very clearly the fruit of obedience, the fruit of walking with God, versus the fruit of disobedience, or the fruit of not walking with God. And in this time, in this covenant-breaking, moral decay era of Israel's history, God raises up the prophet Elijah. In the office of prophet in those days, he was to be a spiritual leader in the nation of Israel that God used to rebuke the people of sin and also to call them back into covenant with him. Elijah and the other prophets, they were not fortune tellers or like wizards or things like that. What they were mouthpieces for God's law. And that's exactly what Elijah does here in 1 Kings 18. And in 1 Kings 18, we see this problem. There's this king, the king of the northern kingdom, King Ahab, which in and of himself, being the king of the northern kingdom, was not what God desired. God desired to be one king of the line of David that would ultimately lead to the Messiah to be king over all of Israel and to shepherd them into godliness and to be his representatives to all the nations of the world. But that's not where we're at. We're two kingdoms, both not living in covenant with God. So we're the northern kingdom. King Ahab is leading that. And King Ahab has taken a wife named Jezebel, who was a Canaanite woman, which was also against covenant with God. He was the men of Israel were not to intermarry with foreign women simply because they worship false gods. And the nation of Israel was to be walking in covenant with God, with Yahweh, and ultimately being a city set on the hill, a light to the nations, where others would see what God was doing through the nation of Israel, and they would too repent and come. So we see all kinds of problems through the kingship of Ahab, his marriage with Jezebel, and Jezebel, being a Canaanite, has brought this worship of Baal to prevalent norm in this northern kingdom. And so in 1 Kings 18, Elijah the prophet challenges these false prophets of Baal to prove a point to King Ahab and to the rest of the people of Israel that there is one true living God. There's one God that's in covenant with the people of Israel, and that is Yahweh. And that this quote-unquote God of Baal or Baal, he is simply an agent of Satan to distract the people from serving and living in communion with God. Excuse me. But as we begin the story, we're going to start in 1 Kings 18, chapter 18, verse 20, and read through verse 24, ultimately to set the scene of what happened. So what we see in verses 20 and 21, Elijah challenges the people. He challenges the people of Israel and also these prophets of Baal. He says, starting in verse 20, so Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him a word. But then as we get into verse 22 through 24, we see that this challenge that Elijah presents is accepted. So then Elijah said to the people, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal prophets are 450 men. So it's one prophet for Yahweh versus 450 prophets of Baal. Let two bulls, this is verse 23, let two bulls be given to us, and let them choose one bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people answered, it is well spoken. So we see Elijah challenges the people saying, hey, let's put this Baal to the test against the God that I serve. There's only one of me as his prophet. There's 450 of you. Let's line up a bull. Let's see which God will provide fire for an offering. The challenge is accepted. But as we move into verses 25 through 29, we see very clearly this competition becoming what is fake. That means what I'm saying there when I say what is fake, this false god Baal, so we see his fakeness, versus what is true, that being how Yahweh responds to this, the one true living God. So what is fake versus what is true? Starting in verse 25, it says, then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourselves one bull and prepare it first. For you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. And there was no voice And no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. Verse 27. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out of them. As midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. So what we see in these 5 verses here, is that the prophets of Baal get to go first, and Elijah, obviously a follower of God, a prophet of God, having the wisdom of God, understanding the truth and the power of the one true living God, pokes the bear. You guys get to go first. You prophets of Baal, you put your bull up there first. There's so many of you and only one of me. Surely your quote-unquote God will answer, knowing full well that he would not. And he made a mockery of these prophets of Baal as they spent all day chanting and going around yelling that this quote-unquote God of Baal would answer and send fire on this sacrifice. And we see it got so bad that they began to cut themselves and mutilate themselves. And the more they did that, the more foolish they looked. And Elijah knew that, and he made fun of them and discredited their God of Baal. And we see very quickly that these man-made gods, whether it be then in their day with this God of Baal, but even today, these gods that we make up for ourselves here in America, man-made gods cannot answer to our true needs. And these man-made gods ultimately make us look like a fool. I've told this story many of times. There was a guy from India who was in the States going to seminary school, and there was a pastor in Georgia that befriended him. They were really close friends. And in order for him to get to stay in America to finish his schooling, he needed to get a job. So this pastor hired him on as an intern and just helped him finish the school and serve in the church. And when he finished the school, he went back to India to be a pastor over there. And so this American pastor, obviously missed his friend, and this American pastor took he and his wife over to India to spend a couple weeks with his friend, just to see him, see how he's doing. And as they landed in India, this American pastor got off the plane. His friend picked him up. They were all happy to see each other. Well, they began to drive to this man's home. And in India, there's hundreds of thousands of gods. There's gods. There's statues and monuments and little figurines made for these gods, and they're all over the place. And this American pastor, he looks at his friend. He said, "Wow, there is so many idols in your city." And this Indian pastor, with sincerity in his heart, and looks at the American pastor and he says, when I landed in America, I said the same thing about there. And if we look at our culture, there is so much, man, whether it be money, things, the stuff we watch on TV, the stuff we buy. These man-made gods cannot answer to our true needs, and they ultimately make us look like a fool. And I would argue also that we see in this story with these man-made gods of Baal, and we can see it in our world today as well. Man-made gods will always let us down, and they will always bring pain with them. In my generation, people in their 20s and 30s, young professionals, one of the greatest, quote-unquote, little g gods, I would say, is comfort and comparison. Comfort meaning that if I make this much money by this amount of time and I live in this house, then I can just ease my way through life from there. I can be comfortable. I don't ever have to be stretched or challenged or be anything other than what I selfishly want to be, and that is comfortable. Because we live in a very comfortable place. And Satan can use comfort to lead us so far away from God's desires for our life. Comfort can lead us to have a very quiet mouth from sharing our faith with those around us. Comfort can keep our mouths shut from standing up for what is right and what is true and the things that God loves, and standing up against the things that God hates. So comfort, but then also comparison, and the adage is very true, and I can tell you stories of my own life in the statement of comparison is the killer of joy. So that being true, that man-made gods always let us down and bring pain. We see this in these guys crying aloud to Baal, cutting themselves, hurting themselves, and getting no answers whatsoever. But we see it also today in our world. We have so many things that we put our hopes and our dreams in that 10 out of 10 times are going to let us down because they're not eternal. They will always come to an end. And then finally, we also see there, verse 29 specifically. Verse 29 says, "And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention." There was no answer from this Baal god because he's not real. He's not true. And these prophets of Baal, they yelled and they mourned. They did everything they could trying to get this fake God to answer them and to prove that he is true. And they got no answer. Man-made gods will never answer to our true needs. That kind of disappointment of these man-made gods not answering makes me think of the stories of the movie called We Were Soldiers. It's one of my favorite movies. And we're right off the heels of July 4th. They always play those kind of movies on TV. And in that movie, they're fighting in Vietnam. And there's a group of American soldiers that get cut off from the rest of their unit. And they're in the jungle. Their lines have been cut. And they literally have to stay there all night. And no one's going to come in and get them until more reinforcement come. And there's a scene in the movie where it says that, "No, we cannot come get you. You will have to survive through the night." No one was going to answer to their need. No one was coming to their rescue. And that had to be some of the... I cannot sympathize with how they felt in real life. I can't sympathize with those kind of moments. But I have to guess that when we have these man-made gods that we desire to satisfy our needs, whether us living today being money, comfort, position, people, or even in this story, these guys wanting this fake god of Baal to answer them. When there's no one coming, there's no answers coming from these things for our needs, it's got to be like those guys stuck in the jungle overnight with no one coming, no one answering. And on the heels of that being quite sad, I would argue that it's quite sad. Can it be funny that Elijah was making fun of these fake prophets, making fun of the prophet of Baal? You know, we can look at it and we can laugh and it can be comical. But at the same time, it's quite sad that they were, their eyes were not open to what is true. Their eyes were blinded from being able to walk in communion with the one true living God. But on the heels of that, we see in verses 30 through 39 that God, the one true living God, that being Yahweh, is proven true. So in these verses, we see that it says that Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, the tribes of Israel, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench about the altar as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. The water ran around the altar and filled a trench also with water. So 12 full buckets of water. And at the time of the offering of oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord God, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things in your word. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me, and this is the key point, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." In this moment, God is proven true. The altar is repaired by Elijah. The 12 stones according to the tribes of Israel. The bull is cut. 12 full-blown buckets of water poured on it. And yet the fire fully consumes it. But in that we see that when Elijah calls on the name of God, he calls him the God of Abraham and Isaac and the God of Israel. What he's saying is that when he says, "You are the God of Abraham and Isaac," God made a covenant with Abraham and carried it on into Isaac that stated that through your lineage, all the nations of the world will be blessed. I will create in you a great people that will be my representatives on this earth. I will give you a land, and I will bless you. And ultimately, the Messiah will come through this lineage. That was the first covenant that God made to institute a people that would become the nation of Israel. And that was an eternal covenant that God made. Though the people of Israel were currently, in the time of this moment taking place, living in complete rebellion against the covenants that God had made. They were serving false gods. They were living in immorality. They had no desire to worship Yahweh. God had made an eternal covenant with them. And Elijah was declaring that, "God, you have made an eternal covenant with us. You are the God of that covenant. And I acknowledge that. You are the one true living God that keeps His word." And then he also says the God of Israel. God made a covenant with the nation of Israel through the prophet, or through the leader Moses, by giving them the law and stating how they were to be His people, His representatives, and how they were to live their life. Though the people of Israel in this time frame were living in complete rebellion, God had not changed. He was still desiring that covenant relationship with them, though that the nation of Israel had rejected it. So what we see in comparison with the prophet of Baal, these prophets were yelling at this false god, yelling out these lies, that these things aren't true. And we see the fruit of that. Nothing happens. No glory comes to that. However, Elijah, the prophet of Yahweh, declares God who is true, that gives him, calls him by His name, and also declares the truths of God, the promises of God, the promises that He made with Abraham and Isaac and with the whole nation of Israel. And he declaring these things that are true, we see God responds, and we see that God is ultimately proven true. And the thing that God does, and His proof of being true, by bringing the fire, consuming the altar, that leads the people to worship. And that's the whole point that He wants. Verse 37, he says, "Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that the people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their stones back." And then in verse 39 it says, "And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, 'The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God.'" God's truth in this moment brings worship. And that is sincerely true in my life. I did not follow Jesus until I was 18. And it wasn't until I opened His Bible and I read who He was and who His Son Jesus was and what Jesus did on behalf of my sin. When I finally read those things, when I read what is true, that's when my heart was turned to worship God. And as I said earlier, we see, when I said about the whole book of 1 Kings, we see the fruit of disobedience versus the fruit of obedience. We see this in this story. We see the fruit of disobedience with the prophets of Baal being made look a fool, proven totally dishonest. That's the fruit of disobedience. The fruit of disobedience in our life is whenever we worship these little g gods of whatever the case may be, whatever brings our heart away from and gathers all of our attention and worship is a little g God. Like I said, comfort and comparison is what is in my generation's world. And also just to the rest of America, whether it be money, other immoralities, people, acceptance, etc., whatever it is, pride. Those things are always proven fake and false. And that fruit of disobedience is on display. But then when we return, we see the fruit of obedience. When Elijah, obeying God, being his mouthpiece, calling people back to covenant relationship with God, we see God answer with what is true, and worship is found. And that is not ultimately where the story ends. We also see not only does God's truth bring worship, it also brings cleansing of sin. Because in verse 40, it says that Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, and let not one of them escape." And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. Since this was a contest between Yahweh and Baal, God and Baal, the prophets of each deity had to be responsible for their respective results. The great sin of King Ahab and his official sponsorship of the prophets of Baal, and now that the fraud of Baal was exposed, his prophets had to answer for it, and they were dealt with according to the law of Moses. And the law of Moses in Deuteronomy 13 says that, "But the prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has taught rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you out of the house of slavery, to make you leave the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from your midst." So you shall purge the evil from your midst. It's gruesome. I wouldn't have wanted to be there. I wouldn't have wanted to see it. But they were in covenant with God, and they were to walk and be his representatives. And that covenant was broken, and it had to be obeyed, as Deuteronomy 13 says. But so it is true in our life. Those things that are bringing us into rebellion, those sins that are leading us into disobedience, they need to be purged from our midst. And so as we finish up this story of the history of the nation of Israel in this moment, kind of asks, what should we do? And I simply believe that we should understand in our world, what is false? What is dragging our hearts away from true communion with God? And what is true? How much time do I spend with what is true? I believe that would answer a lot of the issues that we see in our world, specifically with mental health stuff or depression, anxiety, especially in young people, because they're fed so many things that are lies, whether it be from media or their cell phones, or they don't spend daily time on answering, what is true? So we should look and consider to ourselves, what is false in our world, and how does it need to be removed from our life? And what is true, and how much time am I spending with what